Her fingers dug into his forearm so hard he nearly dropped the tray of champagne glasses, and before he could ask what she was doing, she leaned close and whispered 5 words that would upend his entire life: "Act like my fiancé." Now, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances that arrive when we least expect them, I'd love for you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one remind us that our community still believes in the good things. Now let's get back to Warren and Celeste. Warren Blake had not planned on attending a billionaire's birthday party that Saturday afternoon. He had planned on working it, quietly, invisibly, the way he had worked every catering shift for the past 2 years since his wife passed and left him alone with a 6-year-old daughter named Ivy and a mortgage that didn't care about grief. He carried trays because trays paid for shoes and school lunches and the occasional stuffed rabbit Ivy begged for at the grocery store. He was good at being unseen. Unseen men don't get fired. Unseen men don't get pitted. That afternoon, the sun was pouring gold across the lawn of the Whitfield estate, string lights still off because it was barely 2 in the afternoon, and 200 guests in linen and silk were drifting between fountains and canapes, celebrating the 35th birthday of Celeste Whitfield, CEO of Whitfield Dynamics, a woman whose face Warren had seen on magazine covers but never once imagined would grab his arm like a lifeline. Celeste was, by every account, the most composed woman in the business world. She had taken her father's failing shipping company and turned it into an empire before she turned 30. She didn't rattle. She didn't waver. But that afternoon, standing near the rose arbor with a glass of untouched champagne sweating in her hand, she was rattled to her core, because her ex-fiancé, a man named Grant Doyle who had left her at the altar 3 years earlier for her own cousin, had just walked onto the lawn uninvited, smiling the smile of a man who still believed he owned every room he entered. He was here to humiliate her in front of the board members deciding whether she'd keep her seat as CEO, in front of investors who whispered that a woman who couldn't hold a marriage together couldn't hold a company together either. She needed, in that instant, someone standing beside her who looked steady, who looked like a partner, who looked like proof that she had moved on and moved up. Her eyes swept the crowd in panic and landed on the one man who wasn't performing for anyone, a broad-shouldered waiter with tired kind eyes, refilling glasses like the world wasn't ending. Warren's first instinct was to say no. He had a daughter waiting at his sister's apartment, a shift that ended at 4, and zero interest in playing pretend for people who wouldn't remember his name by sundown. But something in Celeste's voice cracked through her polish, just for a second, and he recognized that crack because he'd heard it in his own voice every night for 2 years, alone in a kitchen, pretending to Ivy that everything was fine. So he set the tray down on a passing table and said the strangest sentence of his life: "Only if you promise to tip your fiancé generously." It startled a real laugh out of her, small and surprised, and something eased in her shoulders. For the next hour, Warren Blake, single father and part-time catering waiter, became Warren Blake, doting fiancé of Celeste Whitfield. He learned quickly that the role required less acting than he expected, because Celeste, away from the cameras and boardrooms, was funny in a dry, self-deprecating way, and she asked him real questions between introductions to donors and executives: what his daughter's name was, whether she liked strawberries, why his hands were rough in a way that didn't match his rented tuxedo jacket. He told her the truth in pieces, because lying felt heavier than the ruse itself. He told her about his wife, Marisol, who died of an aneurysm on an ordinary Tuesday morning while making pancakes, and how Ivy still asked if Mommy could smell her hair from heaven. Celeste didn't flinch or offer hollow sympathy. She just said, "That's the kind of loss that doesn't get smaller, it just gets carried differently," and Warren realized this was the first time in 2 years someone had described his grief without trying to fix it. Grant Doyle found them near the dessert table, flanked by 2 board members he'd clearly cultivated as allies, and he wasted no time needling Celeste about instability, about how a company needs a leader who can keep her personal life together, needling with a smile so practiced it looked almost kind. Warren felt Ivy's face flash in his mind, the way she squared her small shoulders whenever kids at school teased her about not having a mom, and something in him refused to let another person be cornered like that. He stepped forward, not as a hired prop but as a man who'd spent 2 years learning to fight for the people he loved, and said that he found it curious a man could walk away from a wedding day and still lecture anyone about stability. The board members went quiet. Grant's smile thinned. Celeste's hand found Warren's, not for show this time, but because she needed something solid to hold on to, and he let her. The confrontation should have ended there, but Grant, wounded and cornered, pulled out his phone and announced to the small gathering that he'd looked into Celeste's mystery fiancé the moment he arrived, and that this man was, in fact, a waiter on the catering staff, hired for the afternoon, nothing more than a costume. The words landed like a dropped tray of glass. Guests turned. Whispers rippled outward across the lawn like the tide going out before a wave. Celeste's face didn't crumble, but Warren watched 2 years of careful reputation building teeter in her eyes, watched her calculate the damage, the headlines, the board vote scheduled for Monday. He could have stepped back into the crowd right then, disappeared the way unseen men are trained to do, let her handle her own storm. Instead, he did the opposite. He told the truth, loudly enough for the nearest dozen guests to hear, that yes, he was working the party, yes, Celeste had asked him for a favor an hour ago because a cruel man had shown up uninvited to hurt her, and that he'd said yes not because he was paid to, but because he recognized what it looked like when someone was drowning quietly in a room full of people, since he'd been drowning that way himself since his wife died, and any decent person would have done the same. The silence that followed didn't feel like humiliation this time. It felt like something shifting. An older woman near the fountain, who turned out to be Celeste's grandmother and the company's founding matriarch, began to clap, slow and deliberate, and said in a voice that carried across the lawn that she'd rather trust a company to a woman who inspires that kind of loyalty in a stranger than to a man who'd once left her granddaughter standing alone at an altar. Other guests followed. Grant, exposed as the instigator rather than the victim, made a hasty and unglamorous exit through the hedge maze, and nobody chased after him. What happened after wasn't a fairy tale sweep into romance, because real healing doesn't move that fast, and both Warren and Celeste knew it. But over the following weeks, something steady grew between them. Celeste showed up, without cameras, without an agenda, at Warren's sister's apartment, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor helping Ivy build a blanket fort, listening to her explain in exhaustive detail why rabbits were superior to unicorns. Warren found himself invited not as a hired favor but as a genuine guest to smaller, quieter gatherings, where Celeste introduced him honestly, a father, a widower, a man who carried trays to keep his daughter fed and who'd carried her dignity that afternoon without being asked twice. The board vote on Monday went in her favor, not despite the scandal but partly because of it. Investors, it turned out, respected a leader who inspired real courage rather than rehearsed applause. Warren learned, slowly, that being seen wasn't dangerous the way he'd trained himself to believe. Celeste learned that vulnerability, the very thing she'd spent years armoring against, was what had saved her reputation and her company in the end. Ivy, for her part, adjusted to Celeste's presence the way children often do, with blunt honesty and quick acceptance, eventually asking Warren one evening if Celeste could maybe come to her school's father-daughter picnic since her own mom couldn't, a question that undid Warren completely in the best possible way. If this story touched your heart even a little, I'd ask you to think for a moment about the lesson sitting inside it, about how the bravest thing we can do is show up honestly for someone else's storm even when we have no obligation to. If that idea moved something in you, leave a comment below and tell us what act of kindness you'd want someone to offer you on your hardest day. Your words matter to our community more than you know. By the time autumn arrived, Warren was no longer working catering shifts for strangers' parties, though not because Celeste had swept him into her world of wealth and title. He'd started his own small catering company instead, seeded by a modest loan Celeste insisted was strictly business and nothing more, and it grew because people who'd been at that birthday party remembered the man who told the truth instead of disappearing. He hired 2 other single parents in his first year. Celeste kept her company, stronger than before, and kept showing up on weekends with strawberries for Ivy, who decided rabbits and unicorns could coexist after all. Nothing about their story was instant or perfect, but it was honest, built slowly out of one impulsive whisper at a party, one truth spoken aloud when silence would have been easier, and one small hand reaching for another in a crowd of people who mistook composure for strength when the real strength had been standing there quietly the whole time, refilling glasses, waiting to be needed. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Stories like Warren and Celeste's remind our family here that kindness, offered without expectation, has a way of finding its way back to us when we need it most.